true pleasure to be here with all of you. Also to see my very good friend, Dr. Yun here. This is a very, very important and I think timely session on green recovery. But before I get into the presentation itself, just wanted to say that I really want to commend the work that the Project Management Institute does. The focus on designing, implementing, monitoring good projects is extremely critical, and particularly now, I think, with what we've seen with COVID, we need to make sure that projects are delivering on their intended impacts and results, and that boils down to strong skills around project management. So just want to commend and note the work of PMI in that regard. So let me share my screen. I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes, absolutely. If you could kindly just press on F5 to make it full screen.
Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So, what I'd like to do over the next 20 to 25 minutes or so is provide an overview of, from a corporate standpoint, what ADB's priorities are across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think Dr. Yun very eloquently captured the changing imperatives and shifts with global pledges, the risk perceptions around climate change, and the need for investments at scale to deliver on all of this. So I'd like to look at it from the Asia-Pacific standpoint and ADB's corporate priorities, vision, and programs, and then do a bit more of a deep dive on Mongolia itself. So with that, let me move on. So our president has made a very high-level corporate commitment to the priorities around climate change and the SDGs. So this is enshrined in the statement, as you see. We've also seen now in recent times how the COVID-19 pandemic has really prompted the marginal sections of the population, whether it's women, children, low-income and vulnerable households, to really bear the brunts quite disproportionately. Some 3 billion in the population, our global population, are now suffering from hunger and malnutrition. So this is probably the worst crisis we've seen since World War II, and this has been said before. But on the flip side, there is a unique opportunity now, and I think we are at an inflection point in terms of really resetting our economies on a path that's more sustainable, harnessing green growth, and unlocking true development gains for all citizens. So green growth, I think it's important also to understand when we talk about green recovery or green growth, what does that really mean? So this goes beyond the conventional definition of just focus on renewable energy. It actually is any economic intervention that supports sustainable jobs, inclusive development while preserving and protecting natural resources. So for example, forestry activities, whether it's reforestation, afforestation, low carbon transport solutions, which include multimodal options and like cycleways, and creating sustainable tourism opportunities, including community-based ecotourism, can create large number of jobs while protecting the environment. Now, why is the green recovery, I mean, the theme of this conference, why does that resonate so much, and why is it so critical at this point of time? First and foremost, we've seen that the COVID pandemic is not just about health. It really has highlighted the strong interconnection or intersection between health and ecology or environment. People are now talking about a one health agenda. In the region, we know the ongoing pandemic has illustrated the cocktail of factors, the intersection between urbanization, industrialization, pollution, desertification, but most importantly, human-animal interactions that all of this is creating. In the Asia-Pacific region, there's a huge number of what we call zoonotic events, where diseases spread from animals to human beings, just like the COVID-19 pandemic. So you really need an integrated set of solutions to address this. Now, studies show that countries taking strong climate actions between, say, 2020 and 2030 could generate up to 65 million new low-carbon jobs and deliver up to $26 trillion in net global economic benefits. So, this also will then translate to avoided mortality and health benefits. So some 700,000 avoided premature deaths from air pollution are likely to result from such investments. So really important for all these reasons to focus on green recovery and green investments. Now, from ADB's standpoint, we have enshrined and embedded a core commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, the SDGs are the core agenda for sustainable development, and 191 member countries have committed to this in 2025 as part of the United Nations. Achieving this will require not just government and public sector driven finance, but large and significant financing from private sector. ADB's support to the SDGs involves all of its strategies and operations, and the 7 operational priorities, whether it's around reducing poverty, ramping up and accelerating progress in gender equality, around climate change, livable cities, rural development and food security, governance and institutional capacity, and on regional cooperation and integration. So our strategic corporate priorities touch on and intersect with the 17 SDGs. How do we then go about implementing and supporting the SDGs? We finance projects that help member countries. We mobilize finance as a banking institution, including from the private sector. So these are, and then channel these through equity investments, grants, loans, and technical assistance. And we work in partnerships. I mean, the theme of my presentation, working with other development financing institutions, such as the Green Climate Fund, other IFIs, World Bank, IFC, EBRD, IMF, but work most importantly with actors on the ground, whether it's civil society, private sector, and community stakeholders, to ensure that these projects deliver results on the ground. Now, putting economies on a low carbon path and meeting the SDG targets requires a huge, significant amount of investments. Estimates range to about 1.5 trillion annually from 2016 to 2030. So this cannot, something this enormous cannot be delivered by governments on their own. So this will require a large amount of private sector investments, and as Dr. Yun pointed out earlier, this will also need blended financing and concessional financing at scale. There is a growing private sector interest in investing in projects with environmental, social dimensions, and green finance involves targeting and channeling some of those investments through green loans, green bonds, and instruments of the like. Mongolia is one of the very few countries that have made very, very significant progress already. I mean, there's still a long way to go, but I think there's very positive signs in terms of aligning their financial systems with the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of why green spending is inherently efficacious, and this is something that's often debated when we look at the literature. I think at the end of the day, we all want to see more jobs, we want to see more revenue, we want to see more income. And the numbers stack up very favorably when we look at green investments versus conventional brown or so-called brown investments. And just to cite one figure, for every $1 million that's spent on energy investments, studies show that renewable energy investments can create 7.5 to 7.7 jobs compared to just under 3 for conventional fossil fuel type of investment. So the numbers are quite speak for themselves. That's why, particularly when we think of Mongolia, and again picking up on the last presentation that Dr. Yun made, the energy transition and moving towards more renewables becomes such an important pathway to address. We've also seen this shift now marked in capital markets. The bond market is becoming a major source of financing for green and social projects. And green and social finance instruments offer not just attractive social results and dimensions, but inherently strong market returns and returns for investors from the capital markets. So I think this is an important asset class, an important class that needs to be looked at as we move ahead. Asia is really now becoming a key hub in terms of such bond issuance, global green bond issuance, a focus of investors in terms of environmentally sustainable growth investments. We're seeing the shift now when we look at institutional investors. There's a marked shift in terms of requiring investments and looking at pipelines of investments that can demonstrate key returns, not just financial returns, but returns in terms of social and environmental metrics. Impact bonds, for example, help private capital to social programs that finance the recovery and delivery of social services, such as health and education. One striking example, just to give you one example of how these bonds can deliver major benefits, was the issuance of the Educate Girls Development Impact Bond in India, which helped my home country, which helped improve education outcomes for marginalized school-age girls. So there was a very tangible, concrete social development benefit. Health bonds are another example where ADB has used ADB projects tackling health challenges in Asia and the Pacific. One of the several examples is used for improving healthcare services here in Mongolia. Again, just to close out the last couple of slides on the corporate picture, ADB has very concrete targets and priorities in terms of its corporate initiatives. We are looking at expanding climate change financing. Up to 3/4 of our projects will have climate change components mainstream by 2030. ADB is looking at about 80 billion, a target of 80 billion in climate financing, about 6.7 billion annually by 2030. So again, a significant ramping up here. Doubling our average annual adaptation and resilience financing to 9 billion annual targets in this period from 2021 to 2024. So the next 3 years. We, like other major IFIs and development partners, are phasing out of any new coal power generation completely and supporting transition. But we are also very aware of the need for this transition to be just, to ensure that jobs are not lost. And so there is a key corporate initiative that's being supported around energy transition, looking at retiring old coal facilities, and a phased investment in terms of new renewable capacity to replace the coal that will be going out of stream, and bringing in the lost jobs as well. A lot of this will require partnerships and working in tandem with other partners in terms of co-financing and raising resources through our own ADB managed trust funds. In terms of green projects itself and the focus towards 2030, we are looking at a very clear transition towards green recovery. And this is embedded through a number of pathways. First is providing dedicated loans for renewable investments, whether it's solar and wind. And we saw the figure in the previous investment where the costs around solar have become much more competitive, in fact, more competitive than coal, certainly. And of course, around electric vehicles. Again, the figure was cited in terms of the penetration of electric vehicles in the markets here. ADB's green loan was the first internationally certified climate loan in Thailand. Just to give you one example there, we are looking at multimodal transport systems, whether it's bus rapid transport, light rail transport systems, which are much less polluting than roads, and supporting the issuance of green bonds in the region to actually target projects which can support the transition to low carbon, resilient and climate resilient economic growth. We're looking at making cities more livable. ADB will provide integrated solutions to help build livable cities that are more green, competitive, resilient, and inclusive. And I will speak a little bit about what we're doing in Mongolia in my latest slide. And also look at inherently supporting community resilience. So in terms of mainstreaming gender into climate change and disaster risk management, operations, and harnessing and supporting women's access to jobs, including through climate smart technologies and venture capital funds to startups. Our overall sectoral breakdown of contributions, you can see that. So I won't try and capture the figures there, but just suffice to say that tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability is a core priority for ADB as embedded in our strategy up to 2030. In 2015 alone, and looking beyond that, ADB made its initial climate finance commitments to double financing, as I mentioned, to 6 billion annually by 2020, and we have more than achieved that target. We've exceeded that target, and you've heard my figures in terms of what we have projected looking beyond 2020. We have a number of projects here in Mongolia that are green bond eligible, and I'm just going to cite a few. There's a upscaling renewable energy project which is focused on Western Mongolia. There's a solar facility that we financed in 2019, which just outside of UB in the Pushig-Hundi area. The Ulaanbaatar Air Quality Improvement Program, which is I think was part of the efforts in terms of the raw coal ban and the phasing out of coal here. Some of the work that I think has really been instrumental in reducing the air quality, particularly the particulate matter emissions here in Ulaanbaatar city to now significantly lower than what was a huge problem, 42+% earlier. And scaling up our sustainable green projects in the agriculture sector, looking at greenhouse technology, irrigation to produce vegetables locally within Mongolia. Let me spend a little bit of time on the greening of exports, energy exports within the region. The Northeast Asia region, and this is the area that comprises the Russian Federation, Mongolia, Republic of Korea, and Japan, is highly emitting. We know that this accounts for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions and around 20% of global GDP. But countries are making significant commitments and pledges around their emissions to reach the net zero target, which was mentioned earlier. And Mongolia can play a big role in helping this region achieve these goals. We have supported a study for looking at the potential for Mongolia to harness and provide green power from the Gobi Desert. We know there's significant wind and solar potential here, up to 2,600 gigawatts of renewable potential for clean power, renewable power generation. The study also demonstrated that just developing 100 gigawatts of this power in the South Gobi and developing the necessary transmission interconnections across the region could contribute to substantially reducing the region's emissions and save around 10 billion a year compared to isolated power systems. Now, just following on that, looking at the energy transition in Mongolia, and we heard a little bit about some of the challenges around moving from coal. So it really needs to be, particularly when we look at heating. And we are providing significant financing and technical assistance for the energy transformation within Mongolia's borders. So to support Mongolia's domestic climate emissions, we are supporting renewable power generation developed by both the public and the private sector. And I mentioned that the private sector solar project in Pushig Valley, public sector solar and wind projects in the Altai, Ulestai region in western and central Mongolia, looking at transmission strengthening so that more of this and storage system particularly, so that more of these renewables that are currently curtailed can be taken up. So we had the second largest battery storage project, which was processed last year, which will allow more uptake of renewables to the central energy system. We're also looking at, with heat being so important in Mongolia, we are looking at demonstrating clean heating technologies, whether it's geothermal, solar thermal, and supporting increased energy efficiency, building efficiency in particular in urban areas and in some of the rural areas across Mongolia. The other side of climate change, when we look at Mongolia, it's not just energy, is really about sustainable agriculture and land management. And here we've seen some of the trends here in terms of the intensification of desertification, impacts in terms of as a result of the average temperature increases, the drying out and denudation of the lakes and rivers. We've seen the trends from over the last 15 years or so. Significant number of livestock increases, and the figure there shows how this has gone up to around 70 million in terms of the herd capacity, and this is putting significant amount of pressure on in terms of the arable land, the rangelands in the country. And we've also seen the soil and air pollution and water pollution increasing over the years. So Mongolia has seen significant climate extremes. We have seen warming of over 2 degrees centigrade, 3 times higher than the global average, and declines in rainfall reported between 1940 until now. So significant fluctuations in the rainfall patterns as well. So Mongolia, unfortunately, is a very high-risk country, and harnessing and looking at land resource management, adaptation in our rangeland pastoral managements, and looking at carbon sequestration in our soils will be extremely important. The figure that I've cited is quite significant. Rangeland degradation alone and restoring rangelands could offer up to 450 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent countrywide over a 20-year period. So significant potential here. My last few slides, just wanted to mention a few of our interventions, both on adaptation and mitigation. On energy, I briefly covered our the battery storage project, the utility scale battery storage project. This was a 130 million investment, including 100 million from ADB. We had the private sector project, which was approved in 2019. On agricultural natural resource management, I already covered the vegetable production project. I should mention the project that's under preparation, where we've got significant funding from GCF, both loan and grant, so concessional resources, but also funding from our EU partners to look at rangeland pastoral management in Hog, Ugs, and Bayanulgi in Western Mongolia, but also to look at green agribusiness potential. So transitioning, creating income streams that are based on green businesses in that area. The air quality improvement program was a significant investment. I mentioned that earlier. We are also looking at sustainable tourism development in Hufskul, but also in Hinti. We have the Green Affordable Housing Project, the project that Dr. Oyun highlighted, which has significant GCF financing, both with a huge concessional grant component, and the UB Urban Services and Gear Area investment program, where for the first time we are looking really at large-scale redevelopment in UB City and creating 6 eco-districts within these sub-districts. So we've already got a focus. This is already operational in Bayan Hosho and Selby, and this will be rolled out in the other 4 districts as well. And finally, I just wanted to highlight that urban development, I think, will be a key focus. And another area we'll be looking at is around urban traffic management, looking ahead as we move forward, given the impacts around traffic congestion here in UB City. On agriculture and food, this is something that has a number of knock-on effects, because Mongolia has a huge potential for downstream processing. Out of the 550,000 tons of meat that's processed here, only about 5 produced in Mongolia, only about 5% is processed in country. So huge potential to develop and harness the processing sector and do it supporting green development. So I think on organic meat, huge potential there, and also looking at bringing the SMEs along. So we've had projects where we work with them. I wanted to mention the herders and farmers that have been trained in warehouse standards, and SME loans increased through an agriculture and rural development project, saw an about 15% increase in loans to SMEs. On logistics and infrastructure, I think this is a key backbone for everything that we have been supporting. A lot of work has gone into building, rehabilitating roads, water supply, and wastewater facilities. And we are trying to do all of this in a way that's climate resilient, climate proofed, and making sure that this is environmentally sustainable. The last area of the column here is around distribution and nutrition intake. ADB was one of the first partners to work with the government and stakeholders here in rolling out the food stamp program, and later on the child money program as well. And as we've seen with the current pandemic, it's important to strengthen the resilience of communities and households. This is a very important complementary investments that has to go along with our financing on green investments. My last slide before I end. I'd like to mention to all of you that our upcoming country partnership strategy was approved on September 6th. This is our deepest, most substantial engagement in ADB's 30 years of operations here in Mongolia. This is anchored around 3 strategic priorities, and will have a investment envelope of about 1.5 billion. We're looking at both sovereign, non-sovereign investments and a substantial amount of knowledge support. So the 3 priorities, first will focus on inclusive social development and economic opportunity. And here we'd be looking at health, education, but primarily around skills development. And I must mention the focus on green skills, agricultural skills, and continuing work on social protection. The second theme is very much on infrastructure and climate resilient infrastructure, which needs to be emphasized. So roads, rail, but also looking at digital infrastructure to bring services more directly to local communities. And finally, the last pillar is around resilience around macroeconomic management, debt management, because at the end it's important to secure that for Mongolia. And going back to the strong basis over the last pre-COVID basis, which allowed Mongolia to spend the stimulus package to address the COVID response, and of course green development and green resilience, which will be a key investment going forward. We have 5 priority themes focused on gender equality, private sector participation, which will be cut across all our projects, civil society engagement, digital transformation, and a focus on strengthening institutional quality, and a strong focus on anti-corruption as well. So let me stop then, and back to you, Arunabha.